Firstly, I'll introduce myself. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm Abby Rose. I'm CEO at Viticycle. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Viticycle. We make apps to support observation as a key tool for understanding. And that's for understanding what works specifically on your farm or vineyard. Many of you may already know of or be familiar with Sector, which is our app for vineyards. Sector is easy to understand health and biodiversity, track vineyard activities block by block, and much more. And actually, Sector now includes the Regen dashboard, which we created in partnership with Nicole Masters. It allows you to benchmark and track your regenerative viticulture journey using the 10 regenerative indicators. You can also get tips and tricks from Nicole Masters on how to improve your results as well. So at Viticycle, we're committed to building ecology, profitability, and beauty farms around the world. And we're always being exposed to amazing work happening, but not enough people get to hear about that. And especially the real implementation details, the nitty-gritty of how to take a more regenerative approach. So this series, the Regenerative Viticulture Series, is all about connecting the conversations, sharing knowledge, and highlighting the work of practitioners such as Lucie and Jules, who you'll hear from today, as brilliant resources. So that if you do want to take a more regenerative approach, there are people out there doing this stuff already. So for today, if you could please ask any questions in the Q&A section on Zoom. You can type it in there and it's visible to everyone. And then you can upvote someone else's question using the thumbs up button if you want to hear the answer to that as well. And let's get started. So it's such a pleasure to be talking to Lucie and Jules of Ham Street Wines. I've known you both since early on in your vineyard journey, when you started planting and then you focused. Well, one of the distinctive things about you was that you were focusing on growing regeneratively from the beginning. And now you're also biodynamically certified. So yeah, Lucie and Jules are new entrants and they're always questioning the way things are done. And they've been applying those learnings from the wider regenerative agriculture movement to their vineyard from the very beginning. And as far as I know, you were often one of the first people in the UK to try many of these techniques in the UK vineyard context. So it's really a pleasure to speak to you both today and hear about your experiences of building a regenerative vineyard from the ground up and the wins and some of the challenges or learnings along the way. So yeah, Lucie and Jules, if maybe you could share a bit about your vineyard and your background to get us started.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having us on, Abby. And it definitely felt like we were one of the first ones when we were setting up and trying to navigate our way through this. But we planted in 2019, so we run Ham Street Vineyard. It's a 10-acre plot, so about 17,000 vines with kind of fairly traditional grape varieties. We've got a little plot where we put some apples for some cider later on. We've got a little experimental plot as well with some hybrid varieties. But we planted in 2019, but are currently running it alongside our day jobs. So we both work in kind of 9 to 5 type jobs more in the finance sector. So very, very different from farming. And we wanted to do something that was a little bit, I guess, more connected to the earth, a little bit more manual, a bit more kind of Mother Nature orientated. And we looked to do something fairly conventional to start with. We were told, no, you can't be organic. It's not doable. So let alone be biodynamic or even more extreme. But we've spent the last few years kind of navigating through and working out how we can go from being told no to experimenting with a whole raft of different methods and speaking to people all around the world, trying to work out how we can do things in a better and more kind of environmentally friendly way. And it feels like we're slowly getting there.
Definitely. That's my experience kind of talking to you and learning from what you've done so far, is that you are getting there and it's really inspiring to watch. And I'm excited to dig into some of the details of that today. Yeah, as you said, you've experimented with many different techniques of regenerative approaches and techniques over the years. And I thought maybe we could just start with some of the basics. Because often, people will say, oh, maybe the first thing you should do is try out cover crops. If you want to take a regenerative approach. And maybe that was some of the advice you got, for example. I don't know. But I'd love to hear a bit about, yeah, what has been your experience with cover crops and how have they worked for you? Yeah, do tell.
Yeah. So yeah, we took on the site back in 2019, and it had been farmed conventionally up until then. So, and it's a very heavy clay soil. So we did things like dig up and do our worm counts and check the structure of the soil, and it all looked pretty dead. It was all very, yeah, all very claggy as well. It was a nightmare in the winter months. You'd walk around and your boots would come back weighing about 2 stone more than they did at the start. So we were really keen to build up the soil health, because as we know, that connects into the vines and builds that really functioning ecosystem under the soil. So we worked with a couple of people initially in the UK scene who'd been working in organics and biodynamics, mainly getting experience abroad, and we had a few recommendations for different cover crops to apply. We've looked to, well, so that first cover crop that we applied was a very heavy rooting cover crop, so lots of carrot, radish, other big rooting cover crops, and it was very diverse as well, with a good mix of legumes as well, like, and things like that, and Phacelia as well for organic matter. The first challenge we ran into actually was just finding someone to apply that mix. The mix had really big seeds with little seeds, and using a conventional drill, the contractor that we worked with just couldn't actually do it properly. And so we tried to apply something in the first year. It only worked across a few rows before his drill broke. And we had to then wait again until the spring to reapply it. And at that point, we actually separated out all the seeds by hand to actually try and do that, because you spend a lot of money on these cover crops, obviously, and you don't want to put it to waste. So that was kind of take one. Take two in the spring in the year following was followed by I think it was 2022 that we did that, followed by a really heavy drought that year. So the cover crops didn't really establish well at all. And since then, we applied, I think, another 3 or 4 different cover crops, trying them at various points in the year. But we tried specifications, and both times those work, because it was followed by like the summer months, quite dry actually. Even the UK can get dry weather. And that meant that those really struggled to establish. So, the big lesson we learned there was, well, one, find someone with the right kit, but also think the actual timing of the application. So we've moved to apply cover crops over the autumn period. So doing it kind of late August, September. August is the best time, because the soils are really warm. You've still got nice long days. You've got enough time for to establish. So we've done that a couple of times, again with kind of mixed success. And the other interesting thing we found is we did an application with a direct drill, where we could to get the seeds off to the right start. They were then direct. Hey, are we back?
Yeah. Okay, so it was your internet, not mine. I couldn't tell.
Yeah, we can tell. Sorry.
Okay, keep going. So I heard up to where you're saying you'd applied them, August is the best time, then September, does, and then I kind of lost you there.
Yeah, so August to September are probably the best times in the UK context, because you've still got good conditions, still got enough time before the first frosts, and the soils are warm, and generally at that point you've got a bit more rain as well to help them establish. The other thing I was saying was the way you're actually applying it, and the ground prep is quite important. We have experimented with direct drilling, but I think there is just a bit too much competition for the cover crop to establish properly. So actually doing a bit of tillage in the alley was quite helpful. And we've always done that, where we've done a light till, we've applied the cover crop, and then we've applied something like humic acid and some compost solution, like a Johnson solution over the top once we've drilled. And that actually had quite good results for us. I think if you're doing a light till and we're only going down a few centimeters, that just helps prepare the soil. And if the seeds are going straight in, you're actually not going to disrupt your soil microbiome too much. Actually, they're going to recolonize from underneath where you've tilled, and then just give the cover crop a really healthy start.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? How that's such in a way, a dogma: no till, or do not turn the soil, move the soil. But actually, I agree. I've heard that from other people as well, that just a slight, very minimal moving of the soil on the top, should we call it, just opening it up so that there's seed soil direct contact, and that it can really get going. It can make a big difference.
Especially if you're only doing kind of every other row once every 3 years or something. So you don't have to be doing it your whole site every year and disrupting the soil.
Totally. And I think you're right in that it's not necessary. It allows to repopulate from below potentially. So it's not actually necessarily a complete disruption in the way that properly turning the soil with a plow might be.
Yeah. And hopefully we will build up enough diversity of the understory over time. And we've certainly seen that there is a good mix of things. We have things like lucerne and clovers coming back each year, even a bit of vetch and things like that, alongside the usual grasses. And we did used to have quite big pressure with things like thistles and docks and things like that, which again, we don't necessarily like to call them weeds, because they are doing something for the soil. Again, they're both very heavy rooting, but the populations of those have actually dropped off. And again, that was one of the things we were told by a lot of conventional farmers: oh, if you've got a dock in your field now, that's just going to take over and become a massive problem. But we found with the soil, with the cover crops and then soil applications, it's just helped things find, a happy balance.
I remember in our first year going out there and spending months over the summer hand weeding or hand cutting back all the docks with big sets of shears and secateurs and a couple of volunteers, and then kind of got past year one and went, actually, it's not an issue. Why are we bothering doing this? This is ridiculous.
So yeah, it's amazing. There are a lot of narratives out there about that kind of stuff. And of course, when you're just starting out, I mean, you can't necessarily question them, but it's great to hear your experience is actually quite different than that. And by adding in the complexity, you've actually managed to avoid some of those potentially, they're just more troublesome at times to have in the middle of your vines, the docks and the thistles. They hurt as well, the thistles. And you mentioned a little bit about compost there. I think it would just be interesting, because I know you, when we talked about compost before, Lucie, you said, well, I don't think the standard PAS 100 compost is quite the same as other stuff. So maybe you could just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think the PAS 100 is really good for a mulch, so just to suppress weeds if that's what you want to be achieving. But I'm not sure there's a huge amount of life in there. And I know you get varying degrees of kind of quality of it. So we've had a couple of different instances, some where there's been lots of plastic that you find in it, and you don't really want that going on your site. And I think it's also it's heated to some quite high temperatures, so a lot of what's in it is effectively dead. So we've used it as a mulch before, but not necessarily so much for feeding our site. We tend to use a couple of different composts. So we use like the biodynamic preps. We go and source some lovely cow poo from a local farm and bury our cow horns to make our BD 500, which is just this beautiful nutrient rich compost that it's phenomenal to see the transition of putting in some kind of poo and straw into a cow horn, and then 6 months later you've got this really rich, beautiful smelling compost. So we use that regularly throughout the year. We then also use Johnson Su bioreactor. So we took a load of our prunings from a previous year, put it into effectively an IBC cage, water it regularly for about 400 days or so, and again you get this beautiful fungal rich compost, which even just a handful of that you can see has so much more life than a PAS 100 application. Compost base for the stew. Throughout the season you see all sorts of different fungus coming up. It's just this beautiful array of life within there, so you know that you're spreading out something that's beneficial. And then I guess the only other one we've tried before but haven't necessarily carried on is some of the Korean natural farming. Have lucky in that we border a woodland, so we can go and kind of put our rice or our potato boxes out in the woodland to harvest some of the mycelium out there. And again, you're kind of spraying the kind of whatever you've got in your woodland is going to hit your vineyard first. So why not kind of give what's in there? So we've kind of used a few different composts, and I think a combination of those is what's working. We wouldn't necessarily know which one's doing the best job, but we've definitely seen that change from a much more of a bacterial site where you've got your docks and your thistles coming up through to much more of a balanced fungal bacterial site. So it's doing something.
Right.
Yeah, and we've had our Johnson Su tested. That there's some labs in the UK where you can send it off to test the bacterial and fungal populations of it, which kind of was reassuring to see everything was kind of in the right place. You know, very fungally dominant compost. But yeah, as Lucy says, I think we've moved the dial a bit in terms of making it a lot more balanced and a bit more fungal. The great thing is we are bordered by this ancient woodland, so trying to bring some of that into the site, I think, will only help.
Yeah, that sounds, well, we've been and it is beautiful. It's very lucky. And I guess one question I just have about the Johnson Su is I feel like sometimes it can seem a little bit complicated. Like there's lots of details of how to do it correctly. Did you find it complicated at all, or was it actually just build the thing and put the tubes in and then water it and it was okay?
Pretty much that. I think the hardest bit was actually getting the lining in so that you don't have everything falling out everywhere.
Yeah.
Securing that.
Great.
Yeah, there's some good online steps to follow. I'd say the other complicated thing was just cutting some holes in a metal IBC container for the tubes. But then the other key thing was actually sourcing some good material to put into it. So as Lucy said, we used vine trimmings, but we also actually took some cuttings from our cover crop, our clovers and things, to mix in some green materials. So again, as long as you've got a balanced compost, and then you just do watering it every day, or not even that in the colder months, but just making sure it's quite moist on top. I think it's actually very easy in the sense that once it's built, you leave it there for 400 days and it's very kind of low effort.
And then when you're using it, because obviously I saw the IBC, it's not making a huge quantity of compost. So are you always using it with water as an extract, or so you're using it as the base of kind of a compost that you're going to spread over a wider area with water? Is that right?
Yeah, so we'll do that. We'll often mix it with the biodynamic preps, the BD 500. We'll also add in things like molasses as well, just to give everything a real kick when we're spreading it out. So we've done that with just spreading by hand with BD 500, but also adding it to the sprayer and using it in regular mixes for foliar sprays and things like that.
Great. Thank you. Amazing. Great to hear some of those details as well, because not that many people have done this in the UK, I'd say. Okay, I'm going to move on to sap testing, because you're one of the few people in the UK that are using regular sap testing in the vineyard. And I know that it's shown you some things that are there in the soil, aren't there in the plant, or are deficient in the plant, particularly around micronutrients. And I'd love you to tell me a bit about your journey into sap testing and also some of your learnings so far.
Yeah, well, I think talking about Regenerative, you wouldn't be talking about it without thinking about sap analysis, which we hear so much about. Again, one of the things we've learned is actually just getting hold of a reliable lab is one of the big challenges you've got to work through, particularly in the UK. Unfortunately, as we've left the EU, we can't send vine material into Europe to have it tested anymore because of export controls. Previously, we worked with a lab in the Netherlands to do that. We now send everything to the US. So I think that's the first thing to do, is to find a reliable lab. And I think in the UK, there are some sap testing labs, but they don't necessarily follow the same methodology as they do in the site we use in the Netherlands or in the US. So they're potentially a little less reliable. But yeah, we talk a lot about soil health, but for us, you need to have plant health as well. That is as important. And although we will see things on the soil test, and in fact, our soil tests come up very nutritionally balanced, what we see in the vine is very different when we do the sap testing. So we often find that there are deficiencies in various micronutrients and also macronutrients. So particularly things like calcium, magnesium, and potassium at different stages in the season. So we'll often, we try and follow a regimented regime with sap testing and test the vines at key points in the growing season. So we try and time it alongside what's going on with the vine. So trying to do a sap test a couple of weeks out from flowering, and then a few weeks after flowering as well, so that we're giving the vine what it needs around those key points in the season. So flowering, floral initiation, also veraise and bunch closure as well. So I think if you time that, you can really maximize the impacts of it. And we found there are certain micronutrients that we're consistently applying, things like iron, and macronutrients like magnesium. But with all of the other nutrients I mentioned, like calcium and potassium and things like manganese and things like that, they are very seasonal. So some years we're having deficiencies, some years not. So I think it's just a case of having regular testing and doing it alongside the kind of growth stages of the vine. The other thing we'd really like to do, but in the UK it's very difficult, is a post-harvest application as well, because I think it would be great to give the vines a little bit of a feed before they go to sleep, but we just find in this country we're harvesting so late. For example, last year we picked on the 30th of October, I think was our final day. The soils are a bit too wet. The vines there's very few leaves hanging on them still to actually do an application. So yeah, I think though it's certainly helped our vines establish. I think it is really important to have that healthy, nutritionally balanced vine to actually help it protect itself from disease pressure and ultimately produce the best fruit it can.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think well, it's interesting to hear at what points you're doing the SAP testing. And one thing I know you said was initially you were a little worried that, because obviously the SAP testing, it suggests, okay, now you need to apply this micronutrient to make things better for the plant. And you're a little worried within, as you're organic and biodynamically certified, that that might not work with those systems, but maybe you could say a little bit about what you found there.
Yeah, I think it's certainly something you should look into before you start the SAP testing. Make sure you get an understanding of what products you can and can't use. But actually, we found that pretty much across all the nutrients that you might need in a typical growing season, there are organic certified alternatives and products out there that you can use. They're often a bit kind of gentler than some of the conventional products, but actually when you read through some of the kind of textbooks on what sorts of nutrients and products are out there, they're often really good, effective products. They're not going to cause big nutrient runoff in your soil and damage the site. So actually they're very good to use and integrate into a spray program. And like I say, actually there's lots of good products out there that we've been able to get hold of. I think it just takes a bit of research.
Like the chelated micronutrients, isn't it? Mainly
Yeah.
that are able to be used, and then we can use, say, we need a boost of nitrogen or something. Then we've got things like nettle teas, so you don't necessarily have to put a product down, but for some of the micronutrients, it is more often than not a chelated product.
And that actually leads in nicely to I wanted to talk a little bit about the sprays that you do use, because when we were talking, you said that one of the things you wish you'd integrated sooner was plant sprays, that you wish you'd integrated those much earlier on, and that you only started in 2023. So yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about like what difference have these plant sprays made, and what are your top tips? Like what are you finding from using them, and what are they, I guess?
So yeah, that was one of the great benefits, I think, of going down the biodynamic path. It certainly opens your eyes to all of the different plants that were used in ancient agriculture, and actually trying to understand a bit more about why you might use them led us to realize that actually there is a lot of science to using those plants. So things like horsetail has got really high silica content, which helps thicken the cuticles of the leaves and actually protects it against things like mildew. And it was quite funny. We went to a organic day and symposium, and there's a big ag company trying to sell us a silica-based product and talking about the efficacy of it. And actually, we were using horsetail tea, which was free and very easy to get hold of. I mean, most people consider it a weed in this country, but again, the biodynamic textbooks are great in giving you an overview of all the different sorts of plants that you can use. So we use probably about 6 or 7 different plants, and we simply brew them into a tea, and then we integrate them into our nutritional sprays, but also our antifungal sprays. So things like horsetail are very good. Also willow, nice salicylic acid, which helps protect the vine. We use those alongside your sulfurs and your coppers, and we always try and reduce the rate of copper or sulfur that we might be using, and I think we do operate at much lower rates than other vineyards might do, and I think a big part of that is using the plant teas. The other thing about the plant teas is, in general, you can use them as a bit more of a preventative spray rather than your coppers and sulfurs, which we generally try and use as just curative. And then other things like dandelion and nettle, as we were talking about, yarrow and things, that they all have connections to some of the nutrients that we were talking about earlier. So your calciums and your potassiums as well. So again, I think it just helps the uptake of some of those nutrients. as well. I think top tip is just get a good supply of them ahead of the season. The other thing we do is we do soak them before we actually make the tea for around 24 hours. Again, that's something that the biodynamic textbooks talk about, just helping get a bit more extraction of the good stuff in the plants.
We also no longer use our lovely Kentish hard water. So I guess one of the reasons we probably started doing the sprays a little bit later with some of the biodynamics was because we didn't have rainwater access. We've now got a 20,000 litre tank to capture enough for the whole season. And it'd be great if we could use seawater, salt water as well. That's very good for increasing the efficacy. But we now just use rainwater, it just helps it bond to the vine in a better way, and you don't have all of the additives that we probably have in our tap water that effectively are designed to kill off whatever's in there. So you kind of having the rainwater is definitely a benefit. So if you can use that, that's also a top tip.
One of the things that really brought that home to me in terms of the effectiveness of the rainwater was just watering our veg patch. If you water with your tap water, the plants kind of seem to do okay, but when you actually use rainwater, everything just blooms so much better. And I think that's just a kind of good lesson in that we don't know fully what's in our tap water. It's obviously not toxic, but it does kind of slow down the soil biology, I think. So if you can get a good supply of rainwater, all the better.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, let's not get into tap water, but it is concerning at times. I agree. Okay, great. Now that's really helpful, and that gives a really good idea of the sprays and how they fit into your system now. And I guess you referred to being kind of preemptive on disease pressure with those sprays. And also, I guess that's a little bit of what the SAP testing is about as well, is like ensuring the vine is healthy and able to withstand or be resilient in the face of whatever's coming. And we talked a little bit about disease pressure and that you've managed to keep it pretty contained generally, even when you thought it might get out of control. Again, because you'd heard from others that, if you have a bit of downy, then within a week, it's going to be everywhere, for example. So maybe you could just share some of your experiences with powdery or botrytis, or it was botrytis, wasn't it, that was going to go everywhere? How has that happened in your vineyard, and what have you done about it? And maybe share some of your experiences there.
So we've had all of the diseases present at some point, but I think with biodynamics, you have a lot less control once it's set in to do anything. So with a conventional spray program, you could probably whip through and kill off whatever mildew or botrytis is out there. Whereas biodynamics and kind of working without those chemicals, you have to be a lot more kind of preemptive and creating resilient vines and ensuring that it doesn't get to that stage in the first place. So we'll often see, and in fact we were talking about this earlier, we'll always have a couple of weeks in the season where I will go, we're going to lose our whole crop, it's going to be a disaster, it's the end of the world, and you'll say, no, it's fine, it's not an issue, we're going to be all right. Every year we have the same debate over a couple of weeks, and every year I'm proven wrong, which I'm happy about. But we will always get, depending on the weather and how the season's going, we will always get a bit of powdery or a bit of downy mildew. And we've learnt not to panic. So the vines are resilient and they are capable of getting through. We will do our kind of preemptive sprays to make sure that around the right weather conditions, we are trying to make sure that the vines have got the right nutrition so that it doesn't set in. But we have had instances where, for example, in the Bacchus a couple of years ago, we had 2 or 3 vines that were really heavily hit with powdery. So we just dropped all the fruit and kind of created a bit of a block so that it didn't spread like wildfire. And so I think being really proactive around noticing when something sets in, and if you can find it on that first vine or the second vine, and make sure that you are proactively getting out there with a bit of, I don't know, bicarbonate of soda or something to stop the spread of it, then that's much more beneficial than just doing blanket sprays throughout the season and hoping that you catch it. There's also a little bit of kind of the mentality around it of, if a little bit does go to disease, that's fine, as long as we've still got a good portion and we're happy with the yield that we're getting. But it's very much kind of year on year debating how we manage it, and keeping an eye on the weather and making sure we're really, really proactive in that space. I think with the botrytis, we'd heard that, you know, once it's set in, you've lost a crop, there's nothing more you can do type thing. And we haven't had botrytis until last year when we got a little bit in our Chardonnay, and we kind of held our nerve, and it managed to hang on with botrytis just a little bit that didn't really spread much for about a month. So the horror stories of as soon as it sets in, your crop's gone in a week just weren't accurate, and kind of just being out there checking, making sure it wasn't spreading, and not doing anything to it, they are resilient and they will get through.
Yeah, and I was chatting to a vineyard that went organic a couple of years ago, and they said, and they're quite a big sparkling wine producer, they said they had huge problems with botrytis year after year, and actually when they made the transition to be organic, the botrytis problems stopped. And I think that was, you know, it was quite surprising. We always think, or sorry, we don't always think, but in the conventional world, people always think organics are under a lot more pressure. But actually, I think you don't only create the resilient vines, you create that more balanced microbiome on your site. There's a lot more competition for space on your vines. You've got lots of good bacteria on there that are effectively out competing things like botrytis. So again, yeah, like Lucy said, we've been through some pretty wet, cold, miserable, and you know, high risk vintages in the UK over time growing, and actually last year was just the first time we'd ever had botrytis. So the vines have stayed pretty clean. And again, I think going back to the timing point, if you're diligent about noticing things and then getting out doing things like the stripping back fruit and then actually doing a spray, if you catch it at the right time, then you can keep it under control. And so the final thing I'd say is we work with some contractors who come in to do various tasks, and they work across the whole of England, and they're often very surprised about the condition of our vineyard relative to some of the more conventional producers that they work with, who, you know, have often, say last year, a lot of them had already lost their crop kind of in July time. And we were actually still looking in pretty good condition. So if anyone's kind of umming and ahhing about whether to go organic, biodynamic, regenerative, I think if you're farming well and carefully, then I think that is going to get you most of the way there.
Totally, yeah. It's a little bit like when we were talking with Robin Snowden about the complexity. Building the complexity is what builds the resilience of the vineyard, and that's really, and then it's paying off in the long run. Although I definitely relate to your holding the nerve, or Lucy getting worried, and it is a little bit of like, you really, really got to believe in those moments and push through. Otherwise, well, you'll never know what happened otherwise. So you found out, which is great.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to, I know that you have an area in the vineyard in the middle that you call the dead zone, which I think is less the dead zone than it used to be, which is great. but it's always been a challenging area of the vineyard, and it's required a bit of extra attention. But it's also allowed you to learn some things and been fruitful in that way. So I was wondering, maybe you could just share a bit of the story about your dead zone.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a little patch. I say a little patch. It probably covers about 2,000 or 3,000 vines, just on the crest of the hill. And our site was farmed quite conventionally for a few generations before we took it on. And as far as we can work out, just the topsoil had gone. There was nothing left there. And although largely the site was pretty dead, there was absolutely nothing within that dead zone part. And so planting vines into that, they've just really struggled. You can noticeably look across the vineyard and see you've got wonderful strong vines on one side and the other side, and then in the center it's these kind of struggling, slightly weedy vines where even things like cover crops struggled to take hold. So what we have spent the last few years doing has been kind of applying a bit more attention to that site. It was really interesting, I think, to see the evolution of it as we've used things like cover crops, where the first kind of year or so, nothing was there, nothing really came through. And then you could see over the years a really kind of strong mix of clover suddenly cropped up. And then kind of when you look at it now, there's much more of a diverse cover across the whole of it. So something's happened, something kicked in and it started to come alive. And then you can also see that the vines in conjunction with that have started to get a bit stronger and produce fruit. And it's just been a very interesting evolution over the last few years to see it develop in that way. So we've used cover crops on it, but we've also paid a bit more attention in terms of extra kind of compost preparations have gone onto that part of the vineyard. So extra BD 500 and extra Johnson Sioux as well. We've done things like chicken pellets in that site. We've really tried just to rebuild what would have been that topsoil in a much more kind of concerted effort than the rest of the site. And it is slowly getting there. It's just taking a little bit more time, as you'd expect when you've got to kind of develop a big chunk of topsoil that's missing.
Totally. And also, I think it's interesting that you've really identified that area and that you are treating it differently. And I think you treat the vines there slightly differently as well, like pruning them harder or trying not to push them as much. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've given them at least a couple of extra years where we've cut them back to almost nothing. We've not tried to take crops from a large part of that site until they're actually ready. And it does make a big difference, even with things like where they do have some crop on them and they're desperately trying to push out some fruit. We've just dropped the fruit. It's not worth trying to push them before they're actually ready. And it's lesson in patience, but
yeah, farming's good for that. Okay, great. I just wanted to ask one more question, and then we do have a few little questions to answer as well. But I just wanted to kind of, in summary, overall, you're 6 years on from planting, and you're finding yourself in a relatively resilient and stable place in terms of your vines. And you also told me that your yields also are kind of relatively stable and resilient. And then that helps you build a more stable and resilient business. And I know that's what you set out to achieve. And I loved, Jules, you said it's not about being hands-off, but being hands-on and targeted when we spoke earlier. So maybe you can comment a bit on that from a general perspective about the diligence required, but also how you've reached a stable cropping pattern and what that means for the business.
Yeah. Well, I think you do have to really understand your site and really think about how you're farming, because you can't just look to a bottle to kind of solve your challenges. So we invested a lot of time trying to understand our soil, up front, the health of the vines through the sap testing. We obviously use Sector to track things as well really closely, and monitor all of those things. But so I think it comes back to building a good picture of your site and understanding where some of the challenges might lie and how you can ultimately help the vines. And then, like I said about being really targeted, not just following a spray routine that says you need to be out in the tractor every 2 weeks doing something, actually matching it to the weather conditions, to what you're seeing on the vine, so that you're not doing just something for the sake of it. There is a purpose to it, and we don't know whether all these things are actually making the difference that that we think they might, but certainly we do try and use data as much as we can to inform what we're doing. We haven't actually done a single nutrient application without sap testing to kind of tell us what we think we should be applying, because if you're applying too much of something or something that the vine doesn't need, you could be locking up other nutrients and causing other problems as well. And so we found that, yeah, the site has established and grown kind of fairly gradually, fairly systematically, and almost predictably, as predictable as you can be with farming. But that has certainly then helped us have a business plan that we can kind of actually work to, that doesn't have the big ups and downs in terms of yield. I think you can become or you can stretch yourself too thinly, and you can get yourself into financial difficulties if you try and grow too quickly, take on too much. Maybe you're buying a whole load of winery kit for a massive vintage that you're then paying off for years, or you're having to get extra machinery for the vineyard to manage a site that might be too big. There is something about just growing sustainably within your means, and that's something we've been able to do with those kind of fairly consistent, gradually growing yields. But that all gives us something to plan off and to work off, and so far it's gone reasonably smoothly.
Yeah, it's been quite stable, and we've deliberately kind of sold an element of the fruit off each year, because we know that we can only manage a certain volume in terms of sales or production. And so we've tried to increase what we're doing bit by bit according to what we can achieve. But it's good kind of looking at last year's yields versus, say, 2023. 23, a lot of people got massive bumper crops, struggled with ripening, but they got huge volumes. We deliberately did a lot of green harvesting and dropped quite a lot of our fruit, and our yield was the same in 23 versus 24, whereas we've heard of kind of stories where people got 30 odd tons down to under 10 tons in 24, and that must be really difficult to manage in terms of yields, like volumes of wine that you're producing off the back of it. How do you manage that level of fluctuation from a cash flow perspective is really hard. So if you can stabilize and actually increase year on year as you intend to, whether that be selling off or deliberately dropping fruit, I think it's worth doing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the final thing I'd add to that would just be there are not that many vineyards that work in an organic and biodynamic and regenerative way. So I think following this these principles does help you stand out against all the other vineyards out there. So in the UK, there's something like 1,000 vineyards. I think less than 10 are actually certified biodynamic. So that already tells you and gives you a bit of a story there. And we've also found that I think our quality of fruit has been pretty consistent as well. We have worked with a winemaker who's bought our fruit and made some wine for us, who's worked with a whole range of other vineyards, who has commented on our fruit certainly always being very easy to start fermenting, happy yeasts on the grapes that just are really keen to get going, whereas some vineyards managed more conventionally, things might take a week or something to get going. And so you've got healthier fruit, and then also it comes through in the actual flavor profile of the wine. There's a freshness and a uniqueness, I think, to the wines as well. So I think all of these things help ultimately build a sustainable business.
Totally. Yeah, no, it's really cool. And also, although you're organic and biodynamic, we talked a little bit about your costs in the vineyard, and they're not overly high either. So you've managed to, by being targeted and by, understanding what you actually need, you're managing to keep those costs way down, I would say.
Yeah. So again, going back to some of the spray products we use, so magnesium is Epsom bitter salts, which is really cost effective. And a lot of the products that we use are naturally derived. So again, there's minimal processing that happens to them. I think we worked out last year our costs for applications on the vineyard was around £300 an acre, which for me doesn't feel too expensive. Again, yeah, we're not just applying things for the sake of it.
I think also having the kind of differentiator of being biodynamic in the UK, where there aren't many of us, we get a lot of help from volunteers because people want to come and learn about it and they want to be part of that journey. So actually, from a kind of a labour perspective, we, like for harvest, for example, we get fully booked, inundated with volunteers, which is fantastic. Whereas we know of a lot of places that struggle to get labour in because everybody's harvesting at the same time, and if you're going through some of the contractors, it's quite difficult to get resources in to actually do your harvesting, whereas we don't, touch wood, have that issue because we do have a lot of people wanting to be part of it, even if it's kind of an educational experience.
Totally. Yeah, it's exciting to be part of that ecosystem in a way and see how it all works.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm just going to jump to the questions we have, and then we could, if we have time, we'll just jump back to some of the other things I was going to ask you about. But we have two questions from Claire Mumford, and she's asked, can I ask which peewees you have? I know you said you had some hybrids. Maybe you could share, do you know which ones?
Test of memory what we put in.
Well, we've planted an experimental plot with 15 different varieties. And we've also co-planted some of the varieties into gaps we had in the vineyard. So we've got things like Sauvignac, Souvenir Gris, Pinitin, then also things like Donau Riesling, Bronner, Reno, Cabotin. There's quite a big list, but we'll dig it out. I think we've posted it on our Instagram page as well, at Ham Street Wines. Cabernet Noir as well, we've got some of that, but we've got, for us, we wanted to plant such a big range because if we ever did plant another vineyard or more vines or decided to do something different, I think hybrids would be something we'd be really keen to explore, because you're not having to spray any of the coppers and things like that to control the mildews. But we wanted to see what actually grows well on our site and ultimately what tastes good as a wine.
Totally.
A long time of making some single bottles of wines. We've only got kind of 5-10 of each of these vines. It's a very small test plot. But
and we only planted it last year. So we are still establishing.
Still early days. But so for the rest of the vines, you have Bacchus, is it Pinot Meunier, Chardonnay,
Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, so pretty conventional. I think somebody referred to Chardonnay as a Ferrari of grape varieties. It takes a lot of attention. It can be, she's quite demanding.
A lot of inputs.
Fair enough. Great. And then the other question is, what's the advantage of putting molasses in the mix? I guess that was with the soil biology. Go ahead.
So we've used it in a few ways. We've actually used it on top of the cover crop spray when we've done a drill. We've treated the seeds as well with molasses, and that's all just to, well, add a little bit of carbon to the soil, but also improve or give the soil biology a bit of a boost. A bit like us, they love sugar, and it will get the populations blooming and growing and give them a good start. So it's a very cost-effective thing to add into your mixes, and you need very little of it. So yeah, I think we've just used it on the seed preps, and then we've also used it with things like the Johnson Sue as well, when we've spread that out into the vineyard or sprayed it again, just to give things a bit of help.
And you said that sometimes you'd use humic acid as well. Do you remember what the source was for that?
I know the company, I think it's Soil Fertility Services,
Okay.
but I can't remember exactly how it was, from what source it was.
That's all right.
Made,
I was just wondering, because I know that some people have struggled sometimes to get good sources of that in the UK.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Okay, I'm just gonna, we've got 3 minutes, so I should stop. But I just wanted to mention that the other thing that we had talked a little bit about was that you started on the bottle side of things, you started reusing bottles. Yeah, maybe do you want to say a few words about that quickly? Because I think that is quite an exciting new approach.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess carbon is probably one of the biggest kind of negatives within a vineyard, and most of that will come from the bottles that are being used in production. So we've started recovering bottles from larger vineyards and wineries that no longer need them, so we can repurpose them. But we've also just started working with a company that will do the washing for us and return it back to us. And then with our distributor, so Wines Under the Bonnet, they've also just started working with a number of restaurants and places across London to do a bit of a kind of a collection service to bring back bottles within a certain spec that we can then use again. And I think that's a real positive in terms of, as an industry, moving forward and not having to kind of have fresh glass each time, because they should have multiple uses to them.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And again, this is one where I think the more people do this, the more demand there'll obviously be for it, and I think the infrastructure will start to scale up for it. It's amazing that no one's tried this or cracked this yet, but I think the more vineyards that start to be asking for this, we'll probably find that it'll be a lot easier to do it. And I think, as Lucy says, that'll be the key to really make ourselves as sustainable as we can be.
Definitely. No, it's brilliant. Brilliant to hear. Well, thank you so much. It is just 1 minute to go, so I should finish up here. But really appreciate all you shared and going into the details of exactly what you've done. And I know it's a huge amount of work. And I do remember in the early days sending some emails saying like, oh, maybe talk to this person or this person. And there was a lot of just not knowing who would know the answer to things. So yeah, thanks for sharing the wisdom that you have built over that time. And it is really impressive. So I just want to reflect that back at you both. And thank you. And so, yeah, we'll share the Ham Street wines. I saw someone already shared it on here, but definitely do go check out your website and your Instagram at Ham Street Wines. Is it all one word?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, at Ham Street Wines. And then we will be sharing this recording in probably next week now. And we'll send some links of where you can find out more about the work Lucie and Jules are doing. If you're interested to hear more about Sector you can always email us on info@vitacycle.com. And if you enjoyed this session in general, please do head to our Regen Viti Hub. It's on the website, and it's a free learning hub where you can access all the amazing practical insights from everyone who's been part of the Regen Viti series, as well as information on doing the regen indicators and that kind of side of things. So thank you so much. And I think we'll stop the recording here.